Well, I'm Greg Sandow, and I'm sitting here with Henry Fogel, who is the president of the American Symphony Orchestra League, and whom I've known for a good long time.
Mm-hmm.
And Henry, of course, used to run the Chicago Symphony before he came here, so you have seen things from the point of view of one of America's biggest orchestras, and now you represent, in some sense, all American orchestras. What is that like?
It's very gratifying, and you also have to go back to the first part of my professional life when I ran a classical music radio station in Syracuse, New York.
When I first knew you, actually.
Yes.
Now that I think of it.
Right. And I actually taped and broadcast the Syracuse Symphony from their very first concert in 1961, and I served for 11 years on their board of directors. So I had a close involvement with a small orchestra for really 15 years, then went to work as orchestra manager of the New York Philharmonic, then executive director of the National Symphony with Rostropovich, and then in Chicago. But I've never lost that feeling for the small orchestra, nor the knowledge that I got in Syracuse that small orchestras in this country are capable of making some extraordinary music.
And here, it's important to say that you have used the bully pulpit that you have with your present job to become the evangelist for the smaller orchestras. You are out there telling the world what's going on.
I think there's a real problem in this country with people, maybe because it's a European-originated art form. There's a feeling that that great music is made in Europe and that some orchestras in America play at that high level, but I'm sure most people let's say in Chicago, where in addition to managing the Chicago Symphony, the Chicago Symphony were the impresario. We were the Carnegie Hall, and we brought in visiting orchestras. There's no question in my mind that if we brought in a second or third line European orchestra, I don't know, I'll make the Essen Philharmonic or something, and the West Virginia Symphony with essentially identical programs, we would have sold 3 times as many tickets for the European orchestra, because people would just assume if it came from Germany it was better than if it came from West Virginia. In truth, I heard a Mahler 5 in Charleston, West Virginia, that I would be proud to have presented in Chicago and would not have apologized for it. And I've been trying to get that message across, that the music making in this country in the smaller orchestras is astonishing. Also, by the way, the programming, people think that the small orchestras, I was talking to somebody just a couple of days ago who said, well, I'm sure at these small orchestras they must do a lot of they must mix a lot of pops in and they must only program Beethoven. And they said, well, just a month or two ago, I was scheduled to visit the South Dakota Symphony in Sioux Falls. I had the flu and I had to cancel. Had I gone, the program I would have seen would have been Haunted Landscape of George Crumb, I think Mozart concerto, standard concerto, intermission, Shostakovich 10.
Well, I know the South Dakota Symphony well because they commissioned a piece from me.
That's correct.
And we just had the premiere 2 weeks ago, and I can tell you that they are very adventurous with all their programming.
Yes.
And they took my piece as well as 2 pieces by Dan Kellogg, their terrific composer in residence, to 4 cities in South Dakota. And their programming is throughout extraordinary. But I've seen just by browsing websites that the smaller orchestras, many of them, do far more new and recent and American music than anybody would think.
Yeah.
And one reason is they're a very big deal in their town, and their audience is loyal. And they only do a few concerts, so each one is an event.
Right.
And if they do something that the audience may not immediately respond to when they hear the name, the audience is going to be interested to come to hear it anyway. They have an easier time, really, than you all did in Chicago.
Well, they also have for the most part, a younger generation of conductors that's more open to looking at the concert ritual as something that can be changed. I heard a conductor, Michael Christie, in his little festival in Boulder, Colorado, come out and explain to the audience that the Bruckner 5 that they were about to hear was a 72-minute symphony, And all he said was something like this, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the perfect way to set this piece up. Bruckner's time world is unlike any others. You can say that Mahler symphonies are as long as, or even longer than Bruckner symphonies, but there are a million musical events in a Mahler symphony. There actually aren't in a Bruckner symphony, and every musical event unfolds very slowly, almost like a flower gradually opening. So if you're going to enjoy this symphony, you need to enter Bruckner's time world. He will not enter yours. So turn off your 20th century or 21st century clocks, and I think you'll be fine. Well, absolute silence for 72 minutes and a screaming ovation at the end. And that was enormous help, and it was a minute and a half that he spoke.
Yeah, I've heard amazing success stories, even from major orchestras, when somebody talks with audiences, even in surveys afterwards, saying they like the parking facilities better. And it was really that somebody cared about them. Now, in South Dakota, which is far from the only example we could bring up, but it's one that I now know a great deal about, the interesting thing is that members in the audience didn't always like the new music programming that was done, but they felt it should have been done anyway. Mm-hmm. And they also, because we have a smaller situation, had the opportunity to talk to the music director, Delta David Geyer, about this and tell him, I didn't like it, or I liked this piece, or I didn't like this piece. David is a very visible, very eager member of the community. He has moved there, and you have access to him in the way that you don't have to a major conductor.
Yep.
So you spend a lot of time, right, traveling around and seeing what orchestras are doing.
In just under 4 years in this job, I have visited 108 different American orchestras and heard 80 to 85 of them in concert.
We should really have just a moment of silence to appreciate the achievement that this is. Henry, I'm not even going to ask you how much of your time that took. That's a major commitment.
I spent half my time on the road. When I took this job, I said to the board, I believe that the league cannot serve, and I prefer the word serve to represent, by the way. Excuse me. The league cannot serve orchestras if it doesn't experience them. And to me, experience them means you spend a whole day there. You meet with the board, and you don't stand up for 10 minutes in front of the board and say, here are league services, and we hope that you will continue to be a member. I actually spend a minimum of an hour with the board and do a lot of Q&A. What's on your mind? What do you wish the league did that we don't do? What do you need? What information from the field, because of my experience, can I bring to you? Because I've had now 43, 44 years in this field in one way or another. I usually meet with the senior management staff. I sometimes meet with the local press if the orchestra wants and sets it up. I meet with the orchestra committee, the players committee. I meet with the music director. I try to spend a little private time with the executive director. I meet with the leadership of the volunteer group, and I hear a concert.
So this leads me anyway to a question that maybe the answer will be interesting. The answer to will be interesting. When you ask board members and others what they need, maybe more broadly, what their problems are, is there anything that emerges, any 1, 2, 3 things that emerge as the most common answers?
There are actually, although there is certainly a wide range, but there are a few things that come up in common. One of the things which actually has affected league programs, because I try to use this information to direct what the league does, particularly in the small orchestras, board training, board development. We feel that you have a lot of services, is what I heard 4 years ago. I don't hear it as much anymore because we now have a lot of services for trustees. We feel you do a lot for managers, but we're not, we get your magazine, but that's it. We don't know what's our role. How do we adjudicate between, if there's a dispute between the music director and the executive director, between the art and the money? How do you balance that? So a lot of governance type questions, board development questions. That's sort of one big area. Clearly audience development. And it's funny, what I often hear is how can we attract a younger audience? And And I first try to force them to define what they mean, because I think that they say that without thinking through, do they mean the 40 and 50-year-old? Do they mean the 20 and 25-year-old, et cetera?
And what's their answer?
Well, often they haven't thought it through that much. They just mean younger than what they're seeing in the hall. And frankly, to be honest with you, I try to focus them on the 35 to 50-year-old range, thinking there's more hope there. When you're 24 or 28 or 32 years old, you're raising kids, you're at the early stage of your career, you're putting money aside for college for your kids. It's harder. It's harder to find the time. It's only as you move on in life. And also I think tastes tend to change. And one of the things I've started to talk about, I mean, it's very interesting, because what happens sometimes, Greg, is I learned something that worked at one orchestra that nobody knows about, because they did it quietly and it worked for them. So about 3 years ago, I learned about Duluth's 50% off price introductory offer for new subscribers. The board in Duluth resisted at first the manager's suggestion to do this because they thought it would get the old subscribers mad. He convinced them that he would answer any complaint they got. It didn't get very many complaints, and it worked. And the shocking thing was that after the new subscribers were finished with their first year and were offered a chance to renew, their ticket price, of course, doubled. We know in the field that the national average for first-year subscribers renewing is about 46 or 47%. Well, 41% of the Duluth first-year subscribers renewed, even though the ticket price doubled, which said once they came in, they liked what they heard.
And there are a lot of success stories to parallel this. One from St. Paul is reaching through neighborhood concerts a new audience. They decided to try to sell them subscriptions. They reduced the price, but they asked people to consider donating the difference between the regular price and the reduction, and people did. But now, what you just said brings up many questions. One of them, which maybe we don't want to get in here, is that I think your 35 to 50s are a less lost cause than your under 35s, because the under 35s have grown up in a completely different culture. And what orchestras do and what classical music does and what the concert environment is may be very, very, very foreign to them, but less so as you get older. But that's a huge question.
Well, it is a huge question, and while I don't have the answer at all, I think it's a really important area of study, and I think one of the things the League is starting to do that we have not done in the past is make connections with people who study that very question. Vanderbilt University Kerb Center for Cultural Policy and other university and other study centers that examine how the coming generations absorb culture, consume culture. And I'm hoping that that will begin to provide some directional suggestions.
Yes. It's actually such a well-known study. There are so many books on current culture. One of the most famous is No Brow.
Yeah.
And I have just started rereading this, and it's amazing how many comments in it there are about classical music, all kind of giving it the back of its hand. Like, why would anybody care about that? But that's a big question, which I personally think orchestras are backward about and need to learn about fast. But
I agree.
Let me come to something that's simpler, but in its way equally devastating. I really believe, number one, that there is no repository, nothing even close, of information on what the hundreds of American orchestras have done. What initiatives they've tried, what success they've had, what failures they've had. The only way I've ever been able to gather this myself is through word of mouth.
It is my hope that if you and I are sitting here in a couple of years, you will not be able to say that.
Right, because this is information gathering is now going to be a big priority.
Yeah, I mean, the League has established a new department with a vice president level senior executive of research and development, precisely because we agree with your statement.
Yeah,
and we believe that we are the only place that makes sense for there to be such a repository.
Absolutely.
Now, we have started a little bit There is an innovations forum on our website, which starts to at least explain, for example, the Duluth ticket thing, but other ideas that you can go to and see, and you can learn who to contact for more information. There's going to be a whole part of our conference coming up in Nashville in June about that's going to have examples with orchestras, staffs present. So, for example, the Chicago Symphony's Beyond the Score series, they're going to be there, and you'll be able to sit down with them and talk to them about what worked, what didn't work, why did it seem to work, which it does seem to be working, what did they do, what are the traps and pitfalls. And there are going to be, I think 15 or so orchestras. Each have their own table, and people will get 15 minutes or however long they need and then move to another one. So we're starting to do that now, but I hope in a couple of years we'll have a much more complete repository.
Right, and everybody should understand that I'm not blaming or criticizing the league. This is a new frontier.
Yeah.
So my next question following up from this is, it strikes me that among the smaller orchestras, they may not know what their peers in other cities are doing.
Well, again, that's our job.
Yes.
That's our job. And I think we're much better at it now than we were 2 years ago, and I hope in another 2 years we'll be even better. Just the fact we have roughly 400 professional members. I've visited 108 of them. That's a quarter of them. And I talk about what I'm seeing as a success elsewhere. I mean, after I learned of the Duluth new subscription offer, and that's just one example of something that worked, I think there are 8 or 10 other orchestras that, because I visited there, have done exactly the same thing. I'm doing, another example of that is I'm doing, in fact, I do it this afternoon, a mentoring circle. I have 2 of them, which are 6 brand new first-year board chairs of small orchestras that spend 90 minutes once a month on the phone with me. And they pick the topics they're interested in. And it was very interesting because at the last one of these, one orchestra said, you know, we've changed the format of our board meetings. Board meetings used to talk about, every board meeting talked about every problem. And we've found that each problem got 8 minutes of discussion, no depth, and we've moved to one big topic, one issue for the board to wrestle with. And one of the other board chairs said, oh, Henry must have visited your orchestra too.
And did you?
And it was true. And I had visited both of them and made that suggestion. So part of getting the word out is something that I try to do in the visits. But again, the conference, the website, which we're completely redesigning, Symphony Magazine, the mission, one of the prime parts of the mission of the League is to be the disseminator of good practices.
All of that is very important, and I'm thinking also of something that's so simple. It strikes me, and maybe I'm wrong about this because I don't visit many of these orchestras, but if you're talking about an orchestra of the size of Duluth or South Dakota, most of the people involved in that orchestra don't, for example, have a standard by which to judge how well they play because they haven't heard other orchestras of their budget level, of their size, just for example.
That's correct. That's correct. You know that you aren't likely in an orchestra with a budget of $1 million and 6 or 7 concerts a year. You're not likely to have the Cleveland Orchestra or the Berlin Philharmonic. What should you expect? What do you have the right to expect? And it varies, Greg, enormously. You have some executive directors and some music directors who get around. You occasionally have some board people who get around. On the other hand, you have some who don't. And I have seen some very sad situations, which will remain nameless, where a music director has been allowed to stay far too long, the orchestra has long outgrown that music director, and no change is made in part because the board doesn't realize it could be better. Now, what's interesting there is I'll tell you who does know. always the musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Because in most of those places, no musician is making a full-time living playing in one orchestra.
So they're getting around their regions.
They are what I call the driving for dollars musicians. Right. There are ways. I mean, and it's something that I have started to encourage in some of my meetings with board members. I think it's incumbent, if the board has an artistic committee, it's not that expensive. Even if it's a volunteer who's got resources,
they
fine.
Could go somewhere. And
two or three
orchestra.
Of those people could get on a plane and go hear another comparably budgeted orchestra. Mm-hmm. But the other thing also is the more and more boards can be gotten to trust their musicians. Very often there's a kind of feeling that, well, I mean, the musicians, they're the employees, they're the professionals. You would never run a hospital where the administrators made all the decisions with no input from the doctors. You would never run a university where the faculty had no input.
Right.
But orchestras often have no input from the musicians. If they set up a channel of communications where they could sit with their musicians, and the musicians would say, look, we play in these 5 orchestras, and all of them are about the same budget size. And we have to tell you, this is the least satisfying.
Yeah. And also,
that could mean something.
No, it really could. And this is a huge question because the musicians generally are the most underused resource of any orchestras, especially, I would think, the big ones.
It takes an opening up of the minds of managements, boards, and also musicians, all of them, to understand that we have got to work together. I mean, one of the things that I also did when I took this job was say to the board, please don't engage me for this job at the League unless you accept my premise that the League serves the institutions of orchestras, which means all of its internal stakeholders.
All of its constituencies.
All of its internal constituencies. I don't believe that we directly serve audiences, which are one of their constituencies. We help orchestras serve their audiences. We don't have the resources to serve the hundreds of millions of people or tens of millions of people. But all of the stakeholders, musicians, volunteers, boards, staff.
Right. And when you say you serve the musicians, this is a major culture change. Mm-hmm. Because the League has always been associated with orchestra management. Yeah. And I know that one of the innovations of your reign here has been to build bridges to the musicians' unions so that they feel that the League knows them, cares about them, and can represent their concerns.
Well, one of the most important things we're doing is for years the League has collected statistics. Up until last year, only managers could get those statistics. All kinds of comparable data about orchestras, finances, and operation. Meanwhile, musicians, because they couldn't get it, went out and collected their own, which often was different. So the first debate at the bargaining table was often...
How are we doing?
Well, but was whose data is right.
Right.
We proposed, first of all, that since we actually knew that the manager's data was generally better, we proposed that we make it available to musicians. Also, by the way, when I went to the AFM and ICSOM and ROPA officials to say, we're here, we serve you too, first question I got was, really? How come we can't get the data?
A fair question,
to which
it?
I said, blah, 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 blah. It's a very fair question. And so I actually got the managers and everybody to agree. But the second part of that, which was suggested by managers, is why don't we work on a project where we reshape the data and get the musicians' input and the managers' input and have only one set of data? But we even agree to make ours available before that happens. So we now have a task force of 2 members of ICSOM, 2 of ROPA. The union can send 2, they only send 1, and 2 managers from each of 3 levels of budgets sizes, so there's 6. And we agreed to not worry about attendance at these meetings by having numerical voting. If we ever have to vote anything, there are 2 votes, a musicians group vote and a managers group vote. And we hired a consultant who, by the way, has now become our new vice president for research and development because everybody was so thrilled with him, to absolutely reshape the data. And the thing that I love, Greg, if you came into one of the meetings of this task force and didn't know the people, you would be unable to tell when people spoke whether they were a musician or a manager.
And we better have a moment of silence for this one. That's really remarkable.
It's amazing. It's a big breakthrough.
Let me ask you about the musicians in the smaller orchestras, the ones who are driving for dollars, as you say, who make a living playing for a number of orchestras in their region and probably teaching as well,
sure.
And playing any other kind of gig that they can get. This is not an easy life.
That's correct.
How are they doing now as compared to 5 or 10 years ago? Are their lives, are their incomes getting better? Are they getting worse? Is it about the same?
I would guess in relationship to the cost of living, it's similar. I don't think it's changed dramatically. Maybe there will be some orchestras that have grown where it's better, and there will be some where it's not, where it's worse. On the whole, and this is data I hope that the future will hold that we don't have yet, but anecdotally I would say for the most part it's roughly similar. And it varies. In Pennsylvania, you can play in 5 orchestras. If you're in the Boise Philharmonic, you can't. It's the only orchestra in 500 miles of any direction. And so there it's teaching. And the other interesting thing is, it's so you can't generalize. There are some musicians that I have talked to who said to me, I could audition for, and I think I could get into a bigger orchestra. I kind of like this life. I like different conductors, different cities. If I want to turn down a gig, I can. I don't want to play 8 services a week for 47 weeks a year. There are other musicians who kill to go to that bigger orchestra.
How old are the people who say that?
I have seen them of all ages. I've seen some young ones, and I've seen some in their 50s.
Because the cynical point of view, or the realistic one, would be the older they are, the more they face college costs for their kids, the more they feel they have mortgages that are urgent to pay, the more tempting a job with a large orchestra might seem.
See, I'm not so sure, because if you play in 4 orchestras, and each one gives 6 concerts, which, by the way, are single concerts, not 4 times a week, you're making, I don't know, $15,000, $20,000 a year from each one of those orchestras. And then you're teaching on the side. And the cost of living in those communities is nowhere near the cost of living in a Boston or a San Francisco or Los Angeles. I don't know how much worse off you are economically. You're more tired. You're on the road more. And I think and you aren't making music with the most glamorous.
And you're probably having to pay for your and your family's health insurance, which is going to cut down on your income. This would be interesting to know about. I know a somewhat comparable group of musicians, not comparable in other ways, New York City freelancers who play orchestral instruments. They burn out, and the mid-career career changes, midlife career changes are rampant among them.
Yeah.
But this is something we need to know about. Anecdotally, I've heard a great deal, and sometimes could put specific orchestras' names to this, of places where people are working more and making less. Or actually not. No, it's actually worse than that. It's more tricky. Their pay rate is higher. The amount of work is less, so they're making less money than they were.
Yeah. Yeah, they're certainly. But, one of the problems is that the trouble makes more news than lack of trouble.
It does, and then we also come back to the lack of data.
Right. Even on a subject that you and I have debated for some years now, which is the question of the aging audience, the data that does exist is largely from larger orchestras. It's not from the under $2 million orchestras. And I have always used as an example the Elgin Symphony, which is an hour west of Chicago. The Elgin Symphony has tripled its number of performances and its budget in 8 or 9 years, and its rate of pay. They actually made a philosophical decision to be the highest freelance orchestra around Chicago, therefore to get the best freelance people. They've tripled they've gone from singles to doubles to triples of each program. And to some degree, and I don't mind saying this because I have said it publicly before, I think that they, to some degree, took audience from the Chicago Symphony because it was more convenient, lower price, you drive your car right up to a lot in front of the hall and park it and so forth. I don't know how many more of those there are. That one I happen to personally experience. That's part of the data collection, and that's why we've decided to have this R&D function to really understand the tapestry. But the thing is, the orchestras that have cut back or are offering less work are the ones that make news. The Elgins don't get talked about as much.
This is true, and isn't it you, Henry, who have talked to me many times about a major East Coast newspaper that covered a financial crisis in an orchestra of that general size, and then when the crisis was fixed, never returned to the story.
When invited to.
When invited to.
Yeah, well, I don't want to tell you what the orchestra was because it was much bigger than Elgin. It was the Louisville Orchestra,
yes.
An orchestra with an important history in America that in the mid-'90s almost went into bankruptcy, got rescued, managed to survive. It's had some problems since then, but it's still playing. There was a major article where that was front page art section and then inside, and talked about how this great orchestra with this history of great American music recordings was likely to go out of business and so forth. And then a few years later, when I actually contacted one of the person who wrote the article, actually, I contacted and said, it's turned around, and I think you ought to do the rest of the story. He said, you're absolutely right, and then 3 days later sent me an email saying the editors aren't interested. And it proves the point, sadly, that the bad news is more interesting than the good news.
And so we can add to the League's burden the education of the press. But let me get back now to something you said that I thought was very important and very resonant. You said you prefer to think of yourself as serving orchestras as opposed to representing them. And the positive reasons for that, I think you've made very clear in everything you've said, because you've named so many ways in which you're able to serve, to help, to bring together, to inspire many, many, many things. I think in spite of this, you're often taken, including by our friends, yours and mine in the press, to be the representative of orchestras in America, because here you are, the president of the American Symphony Orchestra League. And if something happens that appears to have national significance, who are the press going to call for a quote, if not you? So what is that like? Why do you feel you can't represent American orchestras, and what do you do when you're called upon to do it?
Well, I didn't mean to say that we can't represent. What I meant to say was that our prime function is to serve. And I believe that even as we represent, we have to serve. There are actually a few ways in which we do represent. One, before I even get to your direct question, is at the government level, where we lobby for funding, for the NEA, at least to the lobby in whatever ways we can legally as a nonprofit organization. And we also work to represent orchestra's interests in visa and other issues. So we have that
Which are
role.
not small things.
Oh, no, especially since September 11, 2001. Right. You try to get a foreign artist, especially on short notice, if it's a last-minute substitute for a cancellation. It's really hard, and we can help with that. So that's both serving and representing. But also, in terms of your question about the press, I think what I always have to think about, and I have a wonderful help from Julia Kirshausen, our vice president for communications, to keep me honest, I have to think about my response and does it serve the field as well as reflect honesty and integrity. I will never lie, and I will never give a response I don't believe in. But it is possible that I could see myself saying, I just don't think I can get into that because, frankly, I don't think the answer will be helpful to the field that I serve. So the service to me comes first as we are. After all, you have to remember what we are. We're a membership organization. Orchestras pay dues to belong to the league. We are, if all of our members decided to stop paying, we wouldn't exist.
But you know, I guess what I'm getting at when I ask you about representing orchestras is the, I think, very tricky question of to what extent you are able to say, I speak for orchestras when I say X. X is what orchestras believe, and I am now the one who articulates that to the larger public. Because it's not clear what orchestras as a group believe. I'm not sure there is an organization, a way in which this gets discussed and articulated, although maybe the league is it. To what extent, actually, there's a question. What extent is or isn't the league that? The body that can discover what it is American orchestras think and say that to the public.
I honestly believe, Greg, that ability only exists at the really 20,000-foot level. Because when you start getting below that level, it's nonsense to think that orchestras believe anything is a unit. The question that used to amuse me when I managed the Chicago Symphony or any other orchestra, people would say, what do the musicians think about X? Well, there are 110 of them, and there are at least 110 and maybe 220 opinions. And, you know, to think that, I mean, orchestras believe that symphonic music is an important part of human civilization and its heritage, and that it should continue to play an important part in our lives. Orchestras believe that music education in the schools is a very important component of educating the next generation of citizens. On that level, I can comfortably speak for the field. Once I say to myself, well, you know, the New York Philharmonic believes this, but the Tacoma Symphony believes that, and the Omaha Symphony believes that, and they all differ, then I have to say there isn't an opinion. Just as I say, you can't say the musicians of an orchestra all believe something. And that's why, by the way, we get back to orchestra committees, they have a problem. One of the problems orchestra committees have in representing the orchestra is there isn't always a view. You know, I used to tell a wonderful story, and for this I'll keep the conductor anonymous, but a guest conductor appeared for 2 weeks in a row in Chicago, and I got 2 letters from 2 musicians after his 2 weeks were finished, both good musicians, both senior musicians with about 25 or 30 years in the Chicago Symphony, one a string player, one a wind player. One of them said, it's an insult to the Chicago Symphony that you have Conductor X on the podium of this orchestra. You expect me to play my instrument at a certain level. This man's hands are absolutely unclear. None of us can figure out what he means. And it's impossible. If you don't have the craft of conducting down, you shouldn't be conducting the Chicago Symphony. The other musician said, there isn't a conductor you bring in that I look forward to with more warm and keen anticipation than Conductor X. He makes the most magical, wonderful music. Thank you for bringing him. There you are. What I did, by the way, was I covered up the names, Xeroxed the 2 letters, and sent them to the opposite person with a note from me that said, see how hard it is to get a consensus around here. So I think part of our job at the League is to recognize when it is appropriate to speak for orchestras and when it isn't.
And this is tricky, because I'm thinking now of the 1993 report called Americanizing the American Orchestra, which, if you read it now, is the most unremarkable thing in the world. It says things that I think everybody agrees with. There should be more relations with the community. Orchestra should have more to do with American culture, more ethnic diversity. But at the time, it was explosive. It was published as a League document, as if saying, the League believes in this. There was bad press in the New York Times. Some of the major orchestras, as I understand it, had never liked it in the first place. And the thing was effectively buried. It's even rare to find anybody talking about it today. So that may have been a time when the League made an attempt to articulate policy for orchestras, or at least a direction that did not work out.
Without wanting to get into a lot of detail, because I lived through that period, and as the executive director of the Chicago Symphony, I was one of those large orchestra managers that was on the side of supporting that document. But when you start to, and mind you, that wasn't a document that said, here's what orchestras think. That was a document that said, here's what we think orchestras should do.
Which is worse in a way.
Well, harder.
Harder, but more stringent to the orchestras.
Okay, and therein lies the issue. When you start to do that, and we will do some, we are doing some of that, the politics become important. The process is as important as the document. And there were some flaws in the process then, and I will be honest with you, I was a part of the process, and I would do some things differently. The other thing, there were some people in the field who were positive about that report until Ed Rothstein in the New York Times just ripped it to shreds.
And now there was a lot of heat there hadn't been before.
And it was a big piece on Sunday, the dumbing down of America's orchestras. And to be honest with you, some people moved to the other side of the thing, which is not uncommon.
Which is to say, and again, I'm not saying this is a horrible mistake that the league made. I don't think you all had been quite in the position of articulating recommendations like that so publicly, that there hadn't been enough discussion in advance about what to do if there was a reaction like Ed Rothstein's in the Times.
Or, Greg, enough discussion in advance about how to prevent such a reaction by sitting down with the writers ahead of time and talking it through and answering questions.
In other words, what does it mean to publish a report like this, and how do we have to act to get the most out of it?
Which is why the League's current strategic planning process, which sets out all of the things that you have called bold, is a process that went on for 2 years. Americanizing the American orchestra, which, by the way, before I came to the League, was officially buried by the League. If you came into this office and asked for it, you were told it didn't exist anymore and we didn't reprint it. Wasn't true, and I now tell people, yeah, we'll give it to you. We got it. But that process really started after a League conference and after the month after it when people are recovering, roughly end of July, beginning of August, to be published the following conference in June. Yes. In a bound volume, printed, everything else. And so 10 months, actually really 8 or 9, whereas our planning process took 2 years and was published then in a draft form because we thought it through carefully and we went about building a consensus. And where we met with opposition, we did one of two things. We either modified our position or we spent time until we won people over to that point of view. The process, and having lived, by the way, through Americanizing, taught me a lot about how to do what we want to do and not have it rejected.
I'll bet it did, and you have done exactly the segue I wanted to do, which is to contrast that experience with the current strategic planning experience, because there are things in the strategic plan that are bold. There are statements about difficulties that orchestras have had that you might not expect the organization that also has to lobby in Washington for support of orchestras to be making. I really admire that. And the difference in the process, the way you've proceeded this time to make sure that when the thing comes out, the majority of people in the orchestra world are going to say, yes, we stand behind this. We have been consulted. It does, to some extent, represent what we think.
We had, over 2 years, all kinds of meeting groups of administrators. I mean, first of all, we did a survey of musicians, board members, volunteers, and musicians. We had meetings, and we had them in different parts of the country with managers from different group sizes, board members from different group sizes. We sat down, and meetings were, often all-day retreats facilitated. When we would run into an issue, when we would run into a problem, say resistance, not sure the League should be saying this about orchestras, we might bring in funding sources who would say to that group of people, you know what, all of us feel this about orchestras. It's not, the League isn't revealing something here, and in fact, many of the national foundations would welcome the field being honest about its issues. Well, that helped to build a consensus. There also were a couple of ideas that we had in early discussion stages that for the time being we've taken off, put them on the back burner because now isn't the time. Let's build a consensus for what we want to do. But by having these thorough discussions, incorporating people, actually to the point where one group of large orchestra managers finally said to us about 6 months before we released it, it's time you stopped asking for our input and just get on with it.
Just come out with the damn thing.
We're saying we want to be sure when we do there are no explosions. So it was a very careful and very thorough process. I don't remember the number. At one point I actually knew the number, but there were probably over 1,000 people involved in discussions and meetings about this process, from the smallest to the biggest, from youth orchestras, from funders. We had publishers, we had artist managers, we had journalists. I mean, we tried to bring in a broad range of people who interact with orchestras as well as people from inside the field, and really listen to them.
And you really had to make some statement. This is a case, I think, when the League had to step up to the plate and take on the difficult task of representing orchestras, because the thing you always encounter in the press and elsewhere when orchestras are talked about is that the field is troubled, that the field has an aging audience, it has declining ticket sales, and regardless of whether that's true or to what extent it's true, it is the perception.
Absolutely.
So the League cannot not address that. You must address that.
Right.
And you've done it.
Well, we've begun to do it.
You've begun to do it.
I mean, it's one of the principal reasons for establishing this R&D department, which, I mean, some of that came out of these discussions. People said, we need more and better data.
As of course you do. But even, a year ago, when Lowell Noteboom, your terrific board chairman, gave an address at the conference, he outlined some stuff, which I gather is part of their thinking in their strategic plan. That was not the kind of, if I can put it this way, boosterism that you normally hear from a service organization.
Yep.
It was really striking to hear. Of course, knowing Lowell, what else could it have been? And I know it's also your policy to be talking in this way. But it was really a breath of fresh air.
Oh, yeah. And we got a little pushback from, you run the risk, if you have the kind of process I described to you, you do run the risk of coming out with pablum, of coming out with something that offends nobody. We didn't take that point of view. We took the point of view that it's okay to offend all of the stakeholders a little bit. If most of them said, well, we agree with 75 or 80% of it, and we'll live with the other 20, that's good. Because if everybody says, oh, it's great, I have no problem with it, then you're not pushing at all. And we got some pushback about, particularly, candidly, about Lowell's part of it, in which he was kind of blunt about some of the problems, but we didn't get enormous pushback, and we didn't get enormous resistance. And we also had a lot of people, even in the field, as well as people like you, saying it's about time that the field said it and admitted that it was starting to deal with it. So that's, I go back to what I said about the difference between this process and Americanizing. That's the step that was missing in Americanizing. I mean, you're absolutely right. You go back and read that now. Frankly, it looks like a blueprint for a strategic plan, is what it looks like. But if I've learned nothing in 45 years of managing things, one thing I've learned is that process is as important as result. Process gets you result.
So I guess, Henry, you get the Herding Cats Award for the year 2007. Is the strategic plan done yet? Forgive me for not knowing this. I ought to.
The answer is not quite, but it will be by the conference. What was unveiled at the conference last year, and then a little bit later version. Last year, what we said is, here's all the things we intend to do. What it did, and I wouldn't let it be called a strategic plan. I had it called strategic direction. It was actually a debate I had with Lowell, in which in the end he said, yeah, you're right. I said, strategic plan to me includes, and here's how we're going to do it. That part hadn't been done. That we have been working on. We actually presented a preview of it to our board in late April, and they have approved it, and it will come out at the conference. It is just about done.
And then will it be available for anybody to download?
Yes.
Terrific.
Well, actually have it in, I mean, we're going to present an executive summary of it, I think, at the conference, and I think a full version of it in some form.
Yeah, that would seem, well.
I don't know whether it's download or,
well.
I don't know whether it's download or paper or both or whatever.
Download, to me, is the most obvious thing because that's how you expect to get documents these days. But I imagine that many of the people watching this will be very curious to read what you all have come up with after this. Can you say anything? And I suppose here we could wind this up, Henry. It's been an interesting and productive hour, I think. But what is this going to say to the extent that you can say that now?
I think anybody who's watching this that wants to know what it's going to say should go back and replay the hour discussion we just had. It's going to say the various things that you and I have talked about. It's going to say that there are things orchestras do need to work on, and this doesn't mean that every orchestra is deficient in every one of these areas. It just means orchestras need, A, to think about civic connection, about meaning something in their communities. And one of the things, I don't know if these words are in the plan, but it's something I've said publicly a lot. Orchestras need to mean something to more people in their communities than those who will come to subscription concerts. What that something is and who those people are is going to differ from every community. And part of the League's job is to provide modeling, best practices, and show here's how this orchestra does that. Orchestras have to relook at their internal stakeholder relationships. It's the issue you and I talked about a little bit before about the musicians and where they fit in the picture. What's the role of the music director? Should it be the same as it was 50 years ago? Or has that changed, and so forth? Just
to add something here, earlier today I conducted a conversation like this one with Jim Underkoffler, who runs the Philadelphia Orchestra, and they, as Jim said in the discussion, are very focused on what the artistic role of their next music director will be. They actually want to create an artistic planning process that will make stakeholders of a much wider variety of people inside the orchestra than has usually been the case. And the music director, rather than being the dictator of this, or, unfortunately, as too often happens, the dictator only of his or her piece of it, namely the concerts that he or she conducts, the music director will be one vital part of this, so that the artistic planning will come from many people, and the whole orchestra can buy into it.
Sure, but there's a question there. That could work for a full-time 52-week orchestra where all the musicians live in the same city and can get together to participate. Does that work in a place where the musicians play in 5 orchestras and drive in? So
it works in a different way.
Or maybe different things work in it. So, but my point is there isn't a one-size-fits-all.
Right.
Because you also probably don't have, the small orchestras have a staff of 1 or 2 or 3. The big orchestras have an artistic department of 3. It's very different. I learned this. We were involved with this wonderful Ford Made in America program of the Joan Tower piece, and part of our agreement with Ford had to do with credits and so forth.
One piece being written and then being played in every state.
In every state.
By an orchestra. Yeah, and now you're doing it again with the Joseph Schwantner piece.
But the issue is simply, there's an issue with how things look on the website, and one of the small orchestras didn't quite get it right, so I called the executive director, and I said, look, the next time you're talking to your webmaster, if you could, and he stopped me and he said, Henry, I am the webmaster. And that's the difference between the large and the small and the mid-size. So you can't, I think one of the difficulties and challenges, but also fun parts of the League role, is there isn't one size fits all. There is such a range of needs. But that whole issue of internal stakeholders, and then I think it's it's also, and it's related to that, the whole question of the business model, how the business model works, what's the appropriate expense mixture and income mixture and so forth. That's something that we have to provide more data on and more comparison with other nonprofit forms. So what we're going to talk about is how we're going to do that. We're going to talk a lot about what this R&D department will be. And some of the conference this year, which I hope you're coming to, some of the conference this year is, I think, going to be a clear exemplar of the plan. The innovation stations that we're going to have really come right out of the plan and of showing some good practices elsewhere.
So what we have here is, despite so many difficulties caused by the fact that nothing like this has really been done in the past, and that the field is so diverse, and something we haven't mentioned, that some of the players in it are truly gigantic. You know, they have international proportions, not just national significance. And they have been wrangled to the point where the field is able, through the prism of the league, to make a statement about where we are, what needs to be done, and is starting to make that happen at the conference. And everybody watching should come back in a year and see how well they've done with it.
And we can talk again.
And we can talk again. Very impressive, Henry. Thanks.
Thank you.